Journal entry continued. May 13th, 1940, 09:15. Hugh found me leaning against the side of the main hangar, doing my best to keep my breakfast off my flight boots. "Not bad, sport," he said, patting me on the back. 1.5 kills for your first time out. 1.5, I asked? "If you think I am giving you that first doe kill after I blew out its cockpit, you've got another thing coming, kid," he chuckled. "We got lucky there. No escorts on that lot. Wonder what the Jerrys are playing at." "No escorts?" I suddenly found myself wanting to vomit again. I hadn't even looked for escorts. "No matter, I spoke to Terry a moment ago. The Hurricane's all yours. Now I have to go and find Ollie." 09:30. A Hurricane. I touched the wing and rocked the aileron. It was mine. This big heavy fighter bristling with machine gun was entrusted to me. Me. I was just 19 years old, lied to get into the RAAF early, never even learned to drive, and there I was, going into battle in a giant modern instrument of death. Even as I write this, it still seems unreal to me. The mechanics had the aircraft refueled and rearmed within minutes of it hitting the ground. I was just admiring the aircraft when the alarm bell sounded again. I glanced at the clock. I had barely been on the ground for 20 minutes. "Jerry bombers coming for that convoy, squadron scramble." I pulled myself into the seat and began the startup sequence as ground crew jumped up to strap me in. I did my best to look confident. Here we go again, I thought. The tower gave us clearance to finally take off. We had been delayed for several minutes before departing. Apparently the dive bombers that were heading in on the convoy were relatively slow, however these ones did have escorts. 2 flights were sent out ahead of us to intercept them. Ollie, the number 2 in our flight of 3, had remarked that they were lucky bastards getting to fly out against the 109s. I still hadn't had an opportunity to speak to him in person. However, listening to him talk over the radio with what can only be described as bloodlust had me of the opinion that this war may have already taken a toll in his mind. I watched as he pulled smoothly into the number 2 slot in a formation with Hugh. One thing's for certain, there's no doubt about his ability to fly. We continued a smooth bank inland around the back of the airfield, once again heading in the opposite direction from where we knew the enemy to be. However, this time I knew what was going on. We weren't just being sent up in a formation of 3, we were being sent up in a formation of 6. We were waiting for second flight to get off the runway. We listened to the radio as control tower gave them clearance to depart and watched them take off. They followed the same banking turn that we did, although at a much lower altitude. Hugh keyed the mic. "Flight 1 with me. Flight 2, climb to altitude, we'll meet you at the coast." He sounded worried, and that had me worried. As flight and squadron leader, Hugh had a second radio set to receive only in his Hurricane. This was so he could receive direct instructions for the flight, but it also meant that he got reports on everything that was going on in the air. I'd known the man for less than a day and I could already hear it in his voice. Something wasn't going right. The radio was buzzing away with open comms chatter, but it wasn't too long before I heard a familiar voice. "Hugh, 3, this is flight lead. Move on to my 6 and make room for second flight." I quickly checked my shoulder and sure enough, second flight was here already and closing fast. I quickly banked onto Hugh's 6 to make room for second flight lead to take my former position. His second and third quickly formed up right behind him in diamond formation. Once again Hugh's voice pealed out over the radio. "Alright lads, open up the throttles. Our interceptors have hit the escorts, but they've taken casualties. The Stukas are closer than we expected. If we don't hurry up, they'll hit the convoy and take it out before we even arrive." My first time flying in a 6-wing formation in the Hurricane, and I'm not going to tell you that it wasn't exciting. I did my best to keep the right position, but being unfamiliar with the pilots that I was flying with and still learning the aircraft, I always felt like I was in the wrong spot. Second flight, however, was a beautiful sight to behold, with every single aircraft flying in almost perfect precision. It almost looked like the enlistment posters back home. Today really was turning out to be a day of firsts. My first day in the squadron, my first day flying the Hurricane, my first day in combat, my first air-to-air kill, My first time flying in a 6-man formation in the Hurricane, and to finish it off, my first time flying over the Channel. The Channel. Part of my briefing material before being assigned to the squadron was on the Channel, specifically not to get lost flying over it. When I read that, it felt absurd. How could you get lost over the Channel? It's so thin, if you fly down the middle, you can see the shores on both sides. Now for the first time flying above it, I could begin to see the problem. It was a perfectly clear and beautiful day today, so it was quite easy to see the English coastline. And more than that, it was very easy to see the white cliffs and the other landmarks down the coast. Even though the coast was relatively unfamiliar to me, I could still identify it without a problem. But it occurred to me straight away that a little bit of fog, a little bit of cloud cover, a little bit of a storm, and for my compass to fail, and suddenly I wouldn't be able to tell the difference between the English and French coastlines. I shook the thoughts out of my mind. The formation had begun to break up, and I was pulling up onto Flight Lead's tail. Looking out the side of the cockpit and below, I could see the black silhouettes of the enemy aircraft. We were here. I moved off to the left and behind a few. Flight Lead goes first, second goes second, and I go third. I just have to keep them both in eyesight. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't excited. I wasn't looking forward to the killing, my stomach still protested that. But the second Hugh tipped his aircraft over was permission for me to finally unleash the Hurricane. On my last trip home before being shipped to England, my father and I had been enthusiastically discussing the feeling of flight. My mother had made a joke about boys playing with their toys. As I watched my flight lead bank over and force his Hurricane into a dive, I pulled back smoothly on my stick for a big, wide bank and opened the throttles all the way to maximum. She'd been absolutely right. Hugh's fear of arriving too late to intercept the German dive bombers had been well founded. A small flash followed by a popping sound a few moments later let us know that at least one of the dive bombers had already hit its target. I was amazed by how far sound could travel over the Channel. I would learn in the nights to follow that on a calm night you could hear the sound of German anti-aircraft guns shooting down British bombers over France. I came in close on my first target, opening up at near point-blank range. Too close, I pulled up at the last second and felt the vertical stabilizer on the Stuka strike the belly of the Hurricane. Idiot, I screamed at myself in the cockpit as I worked the controls back and forth to see if anything was broken. There didn't appear to be. Continuing a rollover, I was surprised to find the Stuka still flying below me. I pulled back onto its 6 to close in for a second pass, looking closely for any signs of damage. The vertical stabilizer did appear to be kinked, but it looks like my guns had minimal effect. I closed back in and put the Stuka back in my gun sight, this time from a little bit safer range. I drew a line with my guns across the rear of the aircraft at an angle that would allow me to pull down and below it. The briefing material on the Ju-87 had made that very clear. Never get above the elevator when coming in from behind the aircraft. It puts you dead center in the gunner's sights. I didn't have to worry about it with this Stuka, however. My second close pass wingtip to wingtip, I had seen the crimson in the rear of the cockpit. The Stuka was letting loose a thin trail of smoke from the engine, and the gunner was dead. I swallowed hard and pulled back onto the Stuka's 6. Then suddenly a sound from above. A second Hurricane. It was Hugh cutting in. His burst of machine gun fire hit the tail and I watched the vertical stabilizer come flying off the Stuka. I'd never seen a vertical stabilizer come off like that before. Striking it with the belly of my aircraft earlier on must have weakened it. The pilot of the Stuka fought desperately with the controls trying to keep it in level flight, but it was plummeting from the sky. If he knows what's good for him, he'll bail, I thought. I spotted a Stuka already on a dive for the ship below, so I pulled hard on the stick and dove after it. Not fast enough, a massive explosion rocked the boat right ahead of me. It was a big bomb, much larger than the one that had struck the airfield. Despite the distance from me to the ship, I still felt the explosion rattle through the aircraft. I banked over hard, continuing to follow the Stuka, but it reversed its turn quickly and pulled up fast. Little things are bloody manoeuvrable, I thought. I was about to pull into a sharp turn to follow it when I spotted a target directly ahead. Yet another Stuka. Quickly squeezing the trigger, I put a burst up its tail and then once again angled the aircraft, cutting from left to right and pulling below to clear the gunners. A wispy trail of white smoke emerged from the engine cowling as I flew past. Once again I was planning on turning back before I spotted another target ahead, another Stuka. I had ran into a chain of them. I lined up the next aircraft and pulled the trigger. My rounds ripped through its belly and inside, before I passed so close underneath the aircraft that I could have reached out and touched it. Looking back over my shoulder to spot my targets, I saw the pillars of smoke. The convoy was burning. The Stukas had already done their work. At this point there was nothing we could do to save them. We had already failed that mission. I had a small moment of hesitation. The Stukas had already dropped their bombs, they were on their way home, and we were halfway across the channel. Surely there was no point in continuing now. I stopped myself. A convoy of burning ships, all merchants, laid behind us. Most of the crew were civilian. I lined up the Stuka in front of me and pulled the trigger. I don't have time to kill you all before you make it back to France, but you're not making it home. It didn't occur to me until I sat down to write this journal how quickly I went from being disturbed by the killing to wanting it more than anything else. Once again I pulled the trigger, raking the aircraft from right to left and staying below the height of its elevator. I could see the gunner frantically yanking on his MG, trying to get the gun to turn far enough to actually fire at me. Holding a sharp right bank, I brought the plane around for a second pass. I realised as I brought the Hurricane back around for a next pass that I needed to make this fast. We were more than halfway across the channel at this point. Even as I was lining up the shot, 109s were probably deploying from the French coastline to escort their Ju-87s home. I was concentrating so hard on the Stuka that I failed to hear or see the second aircraft coming in. A burst of machine gun fire rippled out from above the cockpit, intercepting the Stuka that I was lining up. I pulled the trigger and hit it as well. Two streams of machine gun fire, hundreds upon hundreds of rounds ripped into the aircraft from two different angles. I quickly checked my shoulder. It was Hugh. He had fallen in on my 6 and moved to intercept the same target as me. I pulled the Hurricane into another sharp bank, bringing it around rapidly so I could watch the Stuka go down. Surprisingly, it was still in the air. My god, how many rounds does it take to kill these things? I said to myself. The Ju-87s were proving to be harder to take down than the Dorniers from that morning. Or at least that's what I thought, but only for a moment. The Ju-87 suddenly peeled hard to the left and plummeted straight into the ocean. There was no parachute, he was too low for that, and he hit the water too hard to have survived. Strangely, in that moment, I didn't feel bad about that. Hugh and I came in fast and low over the area where the convoy had been hit by the Stukas. There was only a greasy smear of oil to indicate that there had been ships there. The damage must have been catastrophic for them to go down that fast. A small fishing trawler moved its way out of the area. A close pass-by, however, revealed a rather large antenna on the back of the ship. Not a fishing trawler at all, rescue and recovery, sent in to try and pick up the crew members after the ships were attacked. Hopefully there were a lot of survivors. We took altitude once again once we hit the coast and ran into the rest of second flight. They were in a holding pattern around the runway. We completed 2 circuits around the runway and we still hadn't received clearance to land. I was beginning to wonder why until I looked down at the runway itself. A tractor and a truck dragged what looked like the remains of a Hurricane off of the runway. I quickly checked the airspace around me and did a head count. There was Hugh, myself, and all of 3 flight. Ollie was missing. I quickly keyed the comms. Flight lead, is that? Hugh responded back immediately, negative. He said nothing else. I was to find out later that Ollie, our second in flight, had actually taken damage and been forced to emergency land a little up the coast. His plane was repairable and he was mostly fine. The damaged Hurricane on the ground, however, being towed away was one of 3 that had belly landed. They were from the Interceptor Squadron sent out to fight against the 109s. 6 aircraft from this squadron and an additional 3 aircraft from a second squadron had been sent to take on the 109 escorts. Of those 9 aircraft, only 5 had returned, and 3 of them couldn't land. What kind of monster was the Luftwaffe flying? My second landing was much improved over my first. I barely felt the bump of touchdown, and the plane was very easy to bring to a stop this time. I knew, however, that I was the first of 5 aircraft to touch down, so as soon as the aircraft was slow enough, I turned off into the midfield to clear the way, and began my taxi back towards the hangars. A million thoughts buzzed into my head this time. The first was the rattle that I'd noticed when I was coming into land. I wasn't entirely sure what was making the sound, but rattling sounds in aircraft is rarely a good thing. And even if the rattle wasn't there, I wanted to get the ground crew to check the aircraft anyway. The aircraft had performed perfectly, even after striking the Stuka's vertical stabilizer, but I wasn't prepared to gamble my life on it staying that way. Along with my aircraft status, I also had running over and over in my mind again the battle itself. Was there anything I could have done in order to save those ships? I was to bring this question up with Hugh much later on in the evening. He had said plainly there wasn't. He had known before we cleared the coastline that we were not going to be fast enough to intercept them before they were in position to drop, and Stookers only need one pass. He was angry about the whole thing, and I couldn't blame him. I was angry too. That more than anything else is what surprised me. When I had first landed this morning after my first flight, all I had wanted to do was get out of the aircraft. My hands had been shaking and I felt nauseous. This time I didn't feel nauseous, although my hands were still shaking. They were shaking with anger. I didn't want to get out of the Hurricane, I wanted it rearmed so I could go back up. Maybe Ollie's bloodlust wasn't quite so insane after all. I brought the aircraft to a stop at the mechanics area. There was nobody there at the time, although I imagined they were all in the hangars dealing with those wrecked Hurricanes from before. I shut down the fuel valve and prepared to switch off the magnetos as the engine came to a stop. One thing was for sure, it's been one hell of a long day.